Welcome back to the European Parliament in Brussels for the second part of Talking Europe. As Vladimir Putin wins a third term in office in the Kremlin, my guest today is Russia's ambassador to the EU. He will tell us his view on the results of the election and on allegations of fraud during the ballot. We'll also talk about the sometimes difficult relationship between Moscow and Brussels on issues such as Syria, Iran, or the former Soviet republics. Ambassador Chizhov, thank you for being with us here on France 24. Even though Vladimir Putin's victory is not in doubt, observers have noted some cases of fraud in the election. The OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has even asked your government to carry out an investigation. We'll talk about this in a moment. But first, let's watch our report.
Protesters rally for a Russia without Putin. The opposition claims the vote was rigged. That's a view bolstered by international vote monitors who say the election was skewed in Putin's favor.
The biggest problem with this election is that there was no real competition. It was not a level playing field and abused executive power, as well as the inappropriate use of administrative resources, ensured that ultimate winner of the election was never in doubt.
The report of election mistakes come in the wake of alleged fraud in Russia's parliamentary elections in December. Those allegations have inspired the country's first mass protests against Putin. The independent Russian vote monitor Golo says Sunday's elections were neither free nor fair.
On election day, there were many violations, though it must be noted that the number of falsifications during voting was down, as was the number of observers removed from polling stations. At the same time, we noted many cases of mass voting under additional permits, or so-called carousels.
Charges of carousel voting, or voters who cast several ballots at different polling stations. Putin returns to the Kremlin at a time of rapid social change in Russia, with an increasingly critical middle class and an explosion in internet use.
Vladimir Chizhov, most experts say it is indeed likely that a majority of Russians did vote for Vladimir Putin, but as we heard, there were cases of fraud, ballot stuffing, carousel voting, as it's called in Russia. Why is it that there were cases of fraud despite the commitment of the Kremlin to a clean election?
Well, first of all, I don't think any serious observer could have doubted that Putin was capable of winning in the freest and fairest election possible. Secondly, there were individual cases of violations of the electoral code, which will all be investigated and relevant court procedures launched, with or without the OSCE, I must say, because it's what the Russian legislation provides for. Thirdly, I think that so much attention to this aspect of the Russian election reflects the high transparency of this electoral process. You may have heard about the web cameras, as many as 180,000 of them installed in practically all the polling stations, and the largest ever number of observers, almost 700 international observers, and several thousand observers, or tens of thousands of observers, domestic from political parties. So all this provided for a full picture, and the full picture in any country. There are no ideal elections anywhere, let's admit it.
When you see these cases of carousel voting, voters being bussed from one station to another to cast their vote several times, this is on a large scale. Who is behind this?
Well, that depends on your definition of large. If it's a dozen cases, then perhaps in a country of 143 million people, it's not that many. Though each individual case of fraud, I agree, is unacceptable and should and will be investigated. Who is behind it? Well, I can presume that perhaps some petty local officials who felt that they would be gaining some brownie points on their image if the percentage of votes for the leading candidate would be higher, I wouldn't exclude that. But this is something that Russian democracy, young as it is, will certainly live to eradicate.
Now, shortly after the election, the election results were announced, we saw thousands of people taking to the street, protesting against the results, but also calling for a more transparent, a more open society, a more democratic society in Russia. Will Vladimir Putin listen to these voices?
Well, first of all, some of the rallies that took place on the Monday after the vote had been planned well in advance. So even the request to the Moscow city government was well in advance of the vote to stage a rally to condemn the falsification of the voting long before it happened. So this was pre-planned, of course. The message for more transparency, well, that's a normal thing, and transparency will certainly improve. I would say that what is referred to as the awakening of the civil society in Russia, I think indeed is a sign of a maturing civil society. People, they are increasingly interested in domestic politics. The reason, I believe, is quite simple. 10 years ago or 15 years ago, people were primarily concerned about their jobs, about their incomes, about their security. Now, having secured all this, they are looking at politics and their own role as members of the civil society.
But what they want, as they told you, they want Mr. Putin to crack down on corruption. They want a fair judicial system. And they say so far, even though Mr. Putin has been at the helm for more than 10 years, it hasn't happened at all, quite the contrary.
Well, corruption, of course, is a serious problem. And it is a serious problem for Russia as well as for many other countries. We're sitting here in the European Parliament that has just recently gone through a corruption scandal of its own. We all have heard news from various European and other capitals, officials leaving their high posts because of corruption. So this is a problem that, of course, is being tackled. It's not easy, I must admit, in a country as vast as Russia. But I'm sure Vladimir Putin, with this credit of support that he got at the last election, is certainly well placed to increase this fight against corruption.
Now, several hundred protesters were arrested following the demonstration. Does this mark the beginning of a new clampdown on dissent in Russia?
Certainly not. Well, they were sitting there waiting to be detained. They were not arrested. They were detained for a couple of hours and then released. But that's what they were hoping for, evidently, because the rally was long over before the police moved in to clear the square. That's quite natural. And as the tweet of the Russian foreign minister indicated, the activities of the police at that particular moment and at that particular place were many times, I would say, more humane than some of the scenes we have witnessed in other countries.
Now, earlier this week, Dmitry Medvedev, the outgoing president of Russia, ordered the prosecutor general to review the case of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once Russia's richest man. He's been in prison for several years. A lot of people regard this sentence as a punishment for his political ambitions. Why suddenly this announcement that the case will be reviewed? Is it a case that Medvedev is reaching out to the opposition?
Well, you'll have to ask him about that. Certainly, this is well in line with the president's, and Dmitry Medvedev continues in the post of president until May, until the handover. It's well in line with his role as guarantor of the Constitution and guarantor of human rights in the country. So that particular instruction to the prosecutor general will lead to a thorough investigation of of the case again.
Do you agree that it's a politically motivated case, Khodorkovsky versus Putin?
Well, it's not Khodorkovsky versus Putin. It's Khodorkovsky versus the criminal code of the Russian Federation.
Let's move on to the relationship between Russia and the EU on certain issues. I'm thinking, of course, of Syria. This week, the EU called on your country to recognize the need for a change of leadership in Syria. So far, Russia has refused to condemn Bashar al-Assad, despite the violence, despite an estimated 7,600 people who died following the violence. What do you respond to Europe when it says Russia must recognize that Bashar al-Assad must go because he's bad for his country?
Well, first of all, Russia is not in the business of regime change, and I certainly hope that the EU is not either. What we need are three things. We need a cessation of violence by all sides involved in this intra-Syrian conflict. Secondly, we need an all-inclusive political dialogue. And thirdly, we must make sure that there is no foreign interference in that conflict or in the affairs of Syria as a sovereign country.
But so far, Bashar al-Assad hasn't reached out to the opposition. What we're seeing is not at all what you're describing.
Actually, I do not want to appear as an advocate of Assad and his government. Neither the position of my country is dictated by any personal feelings to the Syrian president or his entourage. What we support is a fair approach, an objective approach, and of course, due respect to international law. The UN Security Council should not be transformed into a court judging who stays in power or who leaves.
But when you look at the extent of the violence, the dead, don't you fear that Russia will end up on the wrong side of history?
Well, it's only for history to judge which side is right, which side is wrong. What I am disappointed with is the lack of political will on the side of the West, including the European Union, to call on the Syrian opposition to cease violence. Because you cannot solve a conflict like this by putting your weight on one side to the conflict only. So one simple thing, which was actually proposed at the time when discussions were ongoing in the Security Council by my country, to include a reference in that ill-fated resolution calling on the leaders of the Syrian opposition to dissociate themselves from extremists and armed groups with terrorist connections. That was not supported neither by European members of the Security Council nor others.
Moving to Iran, your country has criticized the EU's ban on Iranian oil. Why don't you believe that sanctions will work? After all, Russia also has a lot to lose if Iran is indeed developing a military nuclear program.
I agree with the latter. We do not want to see an Iran or any other country appearing as a new nuclear power in this part of the world or any other part of the world. So we are against nuclear proliferation. We support the overall so-called two-track approach by the 6 or the E3+3 or the P5+1, that's the same thing. And we are in close contact with Catherine Ashton, with other countries participating in this effort. But there should be a balanced approach. Because we feel that the route of sanctions has by now, we supported 4 resolutions on sanctions on Iran. But as we stand now, this route has practically been exhausted because further sanctions would not help. Secondly, we believe that we should pursue a dialogue with Iran, the other track. And there are signs that the Iranian government is sort of opening a window of opportunity for that dialogue to proceed. I am, I would say, moderately hopeful.
Moving closer to home, Belarus, a former Soviet republic. This week, Germany called Belarus the last dictatorship in Europe. Do you agree with that statement?
I don't. I wouldn't like to comment on the comments that followed from the Belarusian capital on this particular statement. But certainly it's not correct to call Belarus a dictatorship. No democracy is perfect. Perhaps the democracy in Belarus is not perfect too. But I think the road ahead is not to isolate Belarus, but to engage it. That's what my country has been doing. Belarus and Kazakhstan have joined Russia in a customs union, and its subsequent stages of integration leading up to an Eurasian Economic Union, built approximately along the same lines as the European Union itself was built years ago.
You said you don't want to comment on the comments made by Lukashenko. I think they're very interesting, though. He said it's better to be a dictator than to be gay, referring, of course, to the sexual orientation of the German foreign minister. He says it himself. It's better to be a dictator. Well, that's, of course, another issue. Now, a last question on Ukraine. In Ukraine, former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko has been sentenced to 7 years in prison. Many, including the EU, views this as a political vendetta from the current president, Viktor Yanukovych. Has Russia put enough pressure on Ukraine to deal with this very worrying matter?
Well, I would say we're not particularly enthusiastic over this case, but we respect the sovereignty of Ukraine and its judicial system. We believe that the case that was the motive for this prosecution was not entirely correct, because it was built on an agreement signed by Ukraine and Russia in 2009 on certain modalities of gas supplies. And I should note that that particular agreement is still in force and is still being implemented by the Ukrainian government. So on the one hand, the agreement is working. On the other hand, Mrs. Tymoshenko has been sentenced for having signed it.
So you agree there is something wrong about this sentence?
There is a certain logical discrepancy.
Thank you very much indeed. Vladimir Chizhov, EU... Sorry.
The other way around.
1, 2, 3. So you agree that there is indeed a problem with this sentence?
Well, I wouldn't like to comment on the legal proceedings. That's an issue for the Ukrainian judicial system. But how I see the case, I've told you so.
Vladimir Chizhov, Russian ambassador to the European Union, thank you very much for taking part in this edition of Talking Europe on France 24. Thank you for watching our program. Please stay tuned on France 24 for more news from all of us here in Brussels. Goodbye.